morning, everyone, and welcome to the 85th episode of the Veritas fact-finding series. And this morning, I'm joined by Ms. Rebekah Wilson. Good morning, Rebekah.
Good morning, Anthony.
We designed this program in the wake of the COVID pandemic as a way to find the truth. In each episode, we go on the ground with industry professionals in an unscripted, candid video format to better understand how the pandemic will affect the future of our economy, our life, and of course, our investments. By way of background, my name is Anthony Scilipoti, and I'm the president and CEO of Veritas, which is an independent equity research firm based in Toronto, Canada. And I'm proud to say we celebrated now 22 years being 100% employee-owned and operated. During this series, and with everything we do, we believe the truth comes from the facts and that better information leads to better investment decisions. Quick disclaimer, this broadcast is not to be taken as investment advice, and participants or employees of the Veritas group of companies may own securities discussed in this broadcast. While we love all our guests, and Rebekah, of course, in particular, this session may contain forward-looking statements, investment opinions, and comments that we may or may not agree with at all. Now, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Rebekah and today's session. And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge something which I think going forward I'm going to continue to do. The land I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Shinabeg, the Chippewa, the the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Now, Rebekah, she's a proud citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario, with roots in Drummond Island and the Georgian Bay region of Ontario. Today, she works with reconciliation. She does teaching with her colleagues on behalf of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, working in the Indigenous Relations Department. Prior to that, she's been very involved from early in her career, working with Indigenous youth for development programs. As well, she's worked as negotiating with the communities on recruiting, solid waste management, in essence, bringing forward and making sure that we're all aware of what's happened with our First Nations and Canada as a whole. Rebekah, it's great to have you on the show today.
Great. Thanks so much, Anthony. And thank you so much for that, that land acknowledgement. That's something that we in our work do at the beginning of all of our meetings. And it's, something that is really important to acknowledge the history of what's happened in our country and within all of North America as well. So my name is Rebekah Wilson. As Anthony mentioned, I'm Métis from the Georgian Bay region. I'm actually joining you today from what's now known as the Chippewa Tri-Council. So I'm in the area of sort of Midland, Penetanguishene area, and the homeland of three First Nations communities: Rama First Nation, Beausoleil First Nation, and Georgina Island First Nation. And this area is actually the homeland, historic homeland of many of my Métis ancestors as well. This is where a lot of my family settled after being removed from Drummond Island. So I'm going to start off, first of all, because one of the questions that I get often asked is, what does it mean to be Métis? So the three Indigenous groups within Canada that are listed within the Constitution are the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And Métis are Indigenous peoples from the three prairie provinces, so Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, as well as parts of Ontario, the Northwest Territories, and as well within the Northern United States. I actually have some Métis family who live in Detroit, so definitely all across North America. And we have a shared culture and history that are really mixed Indigenous and European, primarily French ancestry, and created a distinct group through sort of ethnogenesis by the mid-18th century, kind of during the fur trade era. So during that fur trade era, we had European men who were traveling through communities trading, and they, during that time, were meeting Indigenous women who they then married and had children with, and from that created a new culture, a really rich, distinct culture called Métis. And Métis are one of course, the three Indigenous groups within Canada. As of 2016, there were about 587,545 people who self-identified as Métis within Canada. And then there are also smaller communities who self-identify as Métis in the United States, such as the Little Shell Tribe of Montana. And Alberta is actually the only Canadian province that actually has a Métis Nation land base. So within Alberta, there are 8 Métis Nation settlements and around 5,000 people within those 1.25 million acres. So just a little bit about who Métis people are, but I want to talk a little bit today about, what I do and why. So the work that I do at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is really sort of spawned from a passion that I've had learning about my ancestry and my Métis history. So I learned that I was Métis when I was about 16 years old. And, the reason why I found that out so late in life was because my great-grandfather, who was my sort of closest Métis ancestor, hid his ancestry and hid his ethnicity from our entire family because it meant that we would be able to get jobs. We would be able to have a good education. We wouldn't be Métis are often known as being, not quite Indigenous enough to fit into First Nations communities, but also not white enough to fit into, our Caucasian society. And so often it was something that you didn't really talk about, right? You didn't really talk about being Métis because it was something that you were to be ashamed of. And now that that's sort of changing, this education of what really happened historically is really important. When we're seeing the stereotypes of, you hear about the drunk Indian or, a lot of these stereotypes about communities that don't have a lot of money. We see homelessness, we see violence, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and all of these things, and not really understanding where that comes from. And that's where this history piece comes in. An initiative that Canada took part in the early 2000s was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And, the saying goes that you can't really have reconciliation until you understand the truth. So before you're able to really reconcile with what happened historically, you need to really understand what brought us to where we are today. And so that's part of what I'm going to be talking about today. So what I'm actually going to do is share my screen.
And you would do this with your group within nuclear waste as well as other organizations within the government, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the presentations that we do are typically, we would do them within our staff, but we also have done presentations for different universities. We've done presentations for the Women in Nuclear group. We did actually have elders who participated in the Women in Nuclear Global Conference this year, so countries from all across the world. And it's really actually important to understand that this history of what happened in Canada is actually very similar to the history that a lot of Indigenous communities have experienced across the world. So I met a friend actually years ago from, lived in New Zealand, but his family was from Australia. And when I was talking to him about, residential schools and, the Indian Act and a lot of the restrictions that were put on First Nations, he said, the same thing happened to my grandparents in Australia. A lot of the similar things happened because of what happened. And so what I'll do is I'll share my screen quickly and talk through a couple of different pieces of, this sort of history of what has happened within Canada.
I can tell everybody paying attention, I'm going to send out the link, but Rebecca and I have had a couple of conversations leading up to this, just informing me of what's happened. And when I was so compelled to hear more about it, and it opened my eyes to what's happened. And I think it really puts in, and this is why I wanted to have this session, is it puts into perspective for us, those of us here in the finance industry that hear about, there's blockades for this development of a pipeline or blockades for this, nuclear waste facility or otherwise. And we want to understand, why is this taking place? How can we make it better? And I hope at the end of this, we're all going to be a little bit more educated and aware, so that when we see what's happening as a reaction to today, we can kind of put it more into perspective and better communicate and negotiate to get to a better place for all of us. Anyway, I don't want to cut you off, Rebecca. Go ahead. Let's see this. Let's get on with get the show. That's it.
No worries. Okay, so can you see my screen, Anthony? Can you see
I
the
can,
document?
yep, it's perfect.
Okay, so I just want to talk about this briefly, and I know Anthony's going to send out the link to this video, but I guess just to sort of start off, the Doctrine of Discovery. So when we think about when Columbus first arrived in North America, he came here thinking that he was discovering this new territory that had never been inhabited. And when he came here, he found that there were people that were already living here. There were Indigenous people that had been living here for centuries. And within Indigenous worldview and Indigenous history, that oral history that's passed on through generations, Indigenous people have been living in North America for, pretty close to 15,000 years. There's actually a story about a community in British Columbia that within their living memory, they knew of a site where there was a community that was there. And when they actually did an archaeological dig, they were able to find pieces of that history. So they found clay pots and copper dishes that were used by that community from, for centuries. And so the Doctrine of Discovery essentially was Chief Justice John Marshall in 1823, implemented what was called the Doctrine of Discovery, that basically said that Indigenous people were, because they weren't Catholic or Christian, they were not human. And therefore, because they weren't human, they weren't able to own land and they weren't able to live on that land. And this really sort of started that process of a lot of wars. There was a lot of sickness that happened, a lot of communities that were completely, wiped off the face of the earth. And then this Doctrine of Discovery has also been used in the Supreme Court. So there was actually a case in 2005, the city of Sherrill versus Oneida Nation of New York. And underneath that, saying that because Indigenous people were considered to be semi-sovereign, meaning that they didn't have access to or the ability to own lands, that land actually they were fighting to see if it actually belonged to the European nation and ended up being, of course, owned by the United States. And so a lot of the challenges that we're seeing is communities feeling like the land that they lived on, that their families have lived on for years, was taken away from them. So really encourage you to watch the Doctrine of Discovery. This was actually an act of reconciliation that was done by the Anglican Church of Canada as a way of, issuing apology for what happened historically. And I'll talk a little bit more about the church's role in reconciliation and some of that oppression that happened.
Rebekah, if you hit at the top, you see where it says display settings. If you hit that and say change the different, move your screens, swap presenter view.
Okay.
You might now get, there you go, perfect. That's what you want.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much for that. So to talk a little bit about this sort of brief history of Indigenous relations, and again, this is something that people do their entire PhDs on. So this is just sort of a snippet of what we're talking about. So Canada becomes a country in 1876, and shortly after that, the Indian Act was put into implementation in 1876. So the Indian Act still actually exists today. It is a piece of law, and this is one of the longest pieces of legislation aside from the Canadian Constitution. And when the Indian Act was implemented, basically John A. Macdonald at the time had said, we need to assimilate the Indigenous population into, sort of the general population. We basically want to, get rid of the Indian and the child, and sort of move forward with this more civilized society. And so with the Indian Act came a number of different restrictions on communities. So within each First Nations community, there was an Indian agent who lived in the community. So this would be a member of the government, a Caucasian man or a European man who lived in the community, and they would be the ones that basically policed the community and told them, what they should do and what they shouldn't do. So to give a couple of examples, if you were, living in a First Nations community and you wanted to go visit your cousin in Alberta who lived in a different community, you would have to receive a pass. So the pass system that was in place, you would have to receive, a permission slip to leave your community and go to the other community. And you would be given a period of time, say 2 weeks, that you could go to that other community. And if you didn't return on time or didn't return at all, they would find you and you would be put in jail. Indigenous people were not allowed to enter into any establishment that served alcohol because it was considered to be dangerous because of the stereotypes. First Nations people were not allowed to vote until 1960, which isn't really that long ago. They were not allowed to vote in federal or provincial elections. First Nations people weren't allowed to, choose their own jobs. So growing up, I, for some reason, really wanted to be a weather forecaster. And I would have been told that I couldn't be a weather forecaster. As a woman, my job was to be at home in the kitchen, looking after the kids, preparing the meals for everyone, making sure that everyone's clothes were done up. And the men would be out trading, they would be out fishing, and they were also told that they had to be farmers. So in their communities, that when they were farming, anything that they wanted to sell, they had to get permission, and that money would be shared with the Indian agent in their community. So they weren't even allowed to really make a living for themselves or do anything that they had really wanted to do. And then another piece of the Indian Act that has been since reversed was that if you were a First Nations man and you married a white woman, she would gain status. So she would now be considered a First Nations woman, and any of those children that you had together would be considered First Nations. But if you were an Indigenous woman and you married a white man, you would lose your status. You would now be considered a white woman, and all of your children that you had from that marriage would not be able to access any of the rights and freedoms that were given to them. And so that's has since been reversed. There were, if you were living on a reserve community and you married a white man, you and that man would have to leave the community. You wouldn't be allowed to live within that community. And there are still some communities that are really pushing back against that, mostly because of that mistrust with the white man. Also through this process, there was what was called the residential school system was created. I'm hoping that folks that are on this call have seen in the news some of the discoveries that have been made recently at some of the places where these residential schools were. So during about a century of time, from the late 1800s until 1996, residential schools existed within Canada and also parts of the United States as well. And these schools were really created to literally kill the Indian and the child. They were meant to teach children to speak English. They were not allowed to speak their own language. They weren't allowed to wear their traditional regalia or their traditional dress. They weren't allowed to participate in ceremonies. So typically at the beginning of a meeting, we would do what's called a smudge ceremony, where we would burn sage as a way of kind of cleansing. And there's also science behind sage that it actually is an antibacterial material. And so these children would be sent to the school, they would live there, they would be there for months and months and months. Often they didn't come home. There were children that died at these schools. They experimented on them. There's proof that they experimented on children using the electric chair. They experimented on them, feeding them moldy food or not feeding them at all and seeing what would happen. And these schools were actually built with cemeteries in the infrastructure. So the architecture was done so that there would actually be cemeteries beside these schools, because they knew that many of these children wouldn't be coming home. There were children that didn't come home from schools that actually had run away, trying to get home to their families, and died along their way. If anyone's heard of the Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack Fund, what happened with Gord Downie, the tragically hip singer, was that he had read the story in Maclean's magazine about this young boy, Chanie Wenjack, when he was 9 years old. that he had run away from his residential school to make it home to his family. And along the way, he was walking along this train track, and days later they found his body, and all he had with him was this little jar with matches in it so that he could light a fire to keep himself warm. But he never made it home to his family. And so Gord really took it upon himself to use the last years of his life to really bring some awareness to this. And it's really coming in spades now, because they are doing testing of the grounds around the residential schools. To date, there have been about 7,000 bodies that have been discovered at residential schools in Ontario, BC, Saskatchewan, and that's not even the half of the schools that existed. So there were around 130 church-run schools at the time. Many of them were kids that stayed there for months and months and months. Some of them were actually day schools. And this system included First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children. And they would be, taken from their families. I often hear people saying, well, why did their parents let them go to these places if they knew they were so horrible? And the reason is that they weren't given a choice. So if you weren't going to give up your children, they would be taken forcefully from you, and you would be arrested and put in jail. And you wouldn't be able to go and see them over school break. So a lot of the reason why we're seeing these stereotypes, right? The drug abuse and the substance abuse and the suicides, and this, sort of lack of motivation to move forward is because of this residential school system, because of the trauma that these kids experienced. They were, physically abused, sexually abused, experimented on. And so it really was an awful thing to experience. And I think the most important part of talking about this is that I'm not sharing this with you because I want you to feel any shame or any blame for it, but really just to understand the truth of what happened, as Anthony was saying, to really understand understand the reason why these communities are in such a detrimental state. There was another piece that happened in the 1960s. So the residential school system was, for the most part, closed down in the late 60s. But there was also something called the 60s scoop. And I'm actually just reading a book right now about it. I don't know if you can see it. I'll have to put it in front of my face. It's called A Matter of Conscience by James Bartleman. And it talks about these two twins who were taken from their parents. They had Indian agents who would come into the communities, and they would go to people's houses and say, I heard you were over at this bootlegger's house and you bought some alcohol from him. We're going to have to take your kids. We will issue you a death certificate. So in your eyes, this child has passed on, and this child is going to come with us, and we will adopt them out to a rich white family. Some of them they had ads in newspapers, selling or advertising for, Native kids who people could adopt. And there were so many of these kids who were raised by non-Indigenous families, had no idea that they had any connection to First Nations culture. But often when you hear from them, hear their stories, they say, I always felt like something was missing. I always felt like there was something different about me, something that was missing that I really wanted to find. And a lot of those cases are now being solved as well. There have been settlements that have happened. I actually have a friend who I first met as Dwayne, and he was a victim of the 60s scoop. He was his mom had given birth to him in the hospital, and to her knowledge, he had died. But what had actually happened was that somebody had taken him, and he was adopted out to a white family and moved to Ottawa when his family was actually from Manitoba, and he's, I think, 50 now, and he was just reunited with his birth family and has reclaimed his original name, which was Albert, was the name that his mother had given him. And so now he's been able to reconnect with his ancestry and his culture. And so there are so many of these stories of people that have just had their culture essentially ripped away from them. And then another piece of this history and some of the misconceptions are around treaties. So Indigenous communities have been developing treaties on their own for many years, but the treaty system actually came out of essentially the fact that First Nations communities, felt like they weren't getting anything from sharing this land. They had this understanding that when European settlers came to Canada, that they would be sharing this land equally, and that wasn't happening. So they signed treaties, hoping that this would overcome some of those challenges. And so within treaties, treaty rights include access to prescriptions. So they gave up their land, and what they got in return was, you hear all the time people saying, well, First Nations people don't have to pay taxes. No, they don't have to pay taxes, but they also don't have access to their own land. They are put on what are called reserve communities, and they live in those reserve communities, and that's all funded by the government. And they're given a pot of money every year from that treaty money to sort of fund whatever they need to do in their community, whether it's healthcare programs, education, those types of things. And so this misconception that all of these things like education and prescriptions and glasses and dental work, that all of that is free, is not true. The freedom is the fact that they get to live on their reserve communities, and everyone else gets to live in towns and cities. And so that's a misconception that's often forgotten about. And then I'll just add two other things before I pass it back, Anthony, if you have any questions. Mercury contamination. So Grassy Narrows is a community in northwestern Ontario. And during the period between 1962 and 1970, there was an oil spill in the community of Kenora. And what happened was that the water and the fish that lived in the water were contaminated with mercury. And that community is still seeing the effects of that. So people, children have been born with deformities. A lot of people in the community are very sick. And this is why these conversations are so important, especially for an industry like the nuclear industry and other industries like mining, those types of things, is because communities have this sort of innate mistrust of corporations, because historically they've just sort of come in and said, here, we're going to do this, and you don't really get a choice. If this is the land that we've chosen to do this on, you don't have a choice. A really great example, actually, if we're thinking about nuclear, is Bruce Power. So Bruce Power, which is near Owen Sound, Ontario. Currently, there's a power plant there, and that power plant was put there without the consent of the First Nation. It was just put there, and they had to deal with it. And then the last thing that I'll add is around long-term boil water advisories. So many of our communities, First Nations communities in Ontario, I think there's around 78 right now. Last year, it was closer to 120. So we're getting to a better place. But a lot of these communities don't have safe drinking water. They don't have safe water to bathe themselves. And a lot of that is because their water treatment plants are so outdated and are not functioning. So they're not able to fix them, because communities aren't able to make money of their own. All of their funding comes from the government. So I'll stop talking. Any questions, Anthony? Is there anything that you wanted me to sort of?
Yeah, I think we have to flesh out some of these topics quickly. And if anyone has a question that they'd like addressed, please scroll down to the bottom of your screen over the Q&A symbol and just type it in, and I'll make sure that Rebekah addresses it. Rebekah, if you just stop sharing your screen, then we'll go to a regular view. Perfect. Quickly, I'll give us a quick story of my own experience. And Jamie Mateer, who I have to thank, shout out here, who introduced us. He also works for the nuclear waste or the nuclear department, nuclear waste management organization. Sorry. And he took me up to Fort Albany, and he used to teach there in that reserve. And we spent 4 days. We went fishing with Kenny, who's one of the natives who lives on the reserve, and he took us out in his power kayak. It was unbelievable. But what an experience, and to just actually see the houses and how everybody's living. And this is a fly-in only place. You can't drive there except in the winter, because during the winter the lakes freeze over and then you can drive there. Otherwise you're stuck with everything in cans. Nothing can be there brought in essentially fresh. It's amazing. But wonderfully warm people that accepted me and took us in, and you know, I was really touched by that. Anyway, I think a couple things that I want to just flesh out a bit here. That we talk a lot about, and now, you know, you're right. Everything about the schools, the residential schools, has come to light. And I hear, you know, we talked a little bit about this, but it's all, you know, and a lot of negativity about it. Was there, I mean, there are stories, and I've read, where individuals have gone to these places and have learned, and there was obviously some bad things that took place, but not everyone died there. Many did survive and have gone on and done things. Can you perhaps provide some perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually work, one of my colleagues who's from Constance Lake First Nation, he attended a residential school and is a survivor, and he, you know, he has a different story. He you know, he wasn't allowed to speak his language, but he, you know, he did feel like he received an education and didn't experience the abuses that he heard about. I think the other piece is when we think about Métis students who attended these schools, they often didn't go through the same abuses either, because they were often used as that tool to say, you know, really embrace your European side and be more like these kids. And so when it comes to that sort of Métis history of residential schools, our ancestors didn't experience that type of violence. And there, you know, I certainly think that there were students who've come away from it with, I think, this feeling of empowerment, of feeling like they did survive something that was incredibly detrimental to so many of their communities. I certainly would say that the bad outweighs the good. And I think that we have learned a lot from it. But I would say, you know, one good thing on the Canadian side is that it was Canadians who stepped forward to make sure that these stories were heard. It was Canadians who stepped forward and made sure that these schools could no longer operate. And so I think that there's definitely, there were some positives that came from the fact that these schools are now closed down, and there were students who didn't experience those types of abuses. So, yeah. Good.
Well, I'm glad there's some perspective there, because we often hear about the negative, and for sure there's a lot of negative. And I think it's important to understand why they first came out in the first place, which was really not necessarily the right reason to put them in place. But in any event, I'm glad you pointed that out, how it started right way back when Canada was formed. So as we're now thinking about, you know, you're now speaking with essentially the finance community of Canada, the investment community. What are some of the things, and it's come in as a question, so thanks for the question, but you're basically paraphrasing what my next question is, which is, what are some of the things that we can do? What businesses can we invest in? How can we better to improve and build wealth and improve infrastructure, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that communities are really struggling with in most communities in Canada are housing. That's something that's a huge challenge within Canada, especially there's a community at Attawapiskat, which is actually not too far from Fort Albany, where you visited, where many of their homes, there are, you know, probably 15 people living in a 2-bedroom home. So putting money into housing, I think that's something that's definitely needed. Putting money towards, finishing or closing out these boil water advisories. There are so many of these communities that don't have access to that. And to really think about what's going on right now with COVID-19. These communities are being hit so hard because a lot of times they can't leave the community. And if they need healthcare, they're having to go to places like Winnipeg or Thunder Bay or Toronto because they don't have the infrastructure. Often they'll have like a nursing station that will have basic supplies like you would, a first aid kit. They don't have x-ray machines. They don't have ventilators. They don't have the types of things that are keeping, sort of our general population alive through this pandemic. And to, I guess, share an example of what happened when the SARS virus was happening. communities were calling for healthcare, and they were calling for support. And instead of sending support, the federal government sent them body bags. And said, this is how we want you to deal with this. And so there's definitely, we've come a long way since then, but there's still a lot of need for healthcare infrastructure, for mental health supports in communities. And oftentimes communities just want to be heard. They just want somebody to hear their plight and understand that, that they are struggling, that they are essentially, these communities are, the living conditions are very similar to a third world country. So there's a lot of need.
Yeah, no, I experienced it. It was, it's unbelievable. If you look at your own work that you're doing with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, obviously this is really, we talk about pipelines. This is even more touchy, if I can use that word. So what are some of the things that you're doing to facilitate these negotiations? Because I think that will be good examples that we can start to think of as we're considering negotiating.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the most important piece that we've learned is it's important to build those relationships before you even bring the word negotiation up. So something that the NWMO has been doing since the very beginning. So 2002 is when the Nuclear Waste Fuel Act came into place, and it mandated us to consult with Indigenous communities. And so consulting with an Indigenous community is sort of that step that you take once you've gone into negotiation, understanding that this is going to be something that is going to impact traditional territory of Indigenous people, and that includes all of Canada. And so what we have done is really engage with communities in their own territories. So we have within our organization an Indigenous engagement team who goes to communities and shares information about our project. So sharing the safety case, sharing what are going to be the impacts on your environment and your way of life. Engaging communities in supporting on these community studies. So testing the waters to make sure, what's the baseline of what the water looks like and how can we prevent that water from being further damaged in the future. We also have within our organization an independent advisory body of First Nations and Métis elders from across Canada. So we ask them for their advice on how we move forward. How do we build these positive relationships with these communities? And I think one of the biggest things is that NWMO has committed to all of these communities that if any of these communities say, no, absolutely not, we don't want this project on our land, we'll step away and we'll start from scratch. So if the communities say, absolutely not, this is our, we're using our veto right, we don't want to move forward, the NWMO will respect that. And I think that that's a huge assurance that a lot of other organizations haven't done historically. And I think one of the really important pieces is just making sure that we're also including Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous voice within any of the research that's going into this project. So, when I was sharing that example of the community in BC that had this knowledge from 15,000 years ago, if you want to look back at, they say history repeats itself. So if we look back at, any type of, one of the questions we often get is, what about earthquakes? How is that going to impact a deep geological repository? So then you look back at the history of the land. How has the rock interacted in the past, and how has plant life come back from other disasters? How do we make sure that we are taking every step that we possibly can to make sure that this community isn't going to be in the position that it has in the past by completely losing its way of life and way of surviving? So, I think that really talking to communities and involving them from the start is really important, as opposed to asking them after the fact if it's okay.
Yeah, I think you get a lot further. Exactly, they're not going to do business with you. Show up on Friday. Hey, we'll have the contract signed by Sunday night. Everything's all good. We'll fly out on Monday. You have to understanding the history and recognizing how they feel at the outset of a discussion. You need to break those barriers. You need to gain the trust. Break some bread, should build a relationship, as you point out. So that's really interesting. Another good question came in. Can you speak on the difference in governance styles for the First Nations communities and how they interface and negotiate with federal and provincial governments?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So, I think it's important to note that as a result of colonization, a lot of the communities have actually taken on a similar governance style to the way that, a mayor and council would work. So in a community, there's a chief and council, and they serve sort of a similar function to again, what a mayor and council system would look like. But I guess it's important to recognize that First Nations in Canada are all governed by the federal government. So all of their funding comes from the federal government, no matter what province they are from. Any of the provinces and territories don't actually have jurisdiction over any of the communities. But what we are starting to see are communities entering into self-government agreements. So they are taking back a lot of their traditional ways of governing. There's actually University of Victoria started its first Indigenous law program a couple of years ago, and really learning about how communities govern themselves in the past. And often communities it was always the women, the grandmothers and the aunties who made the rules, and the men followed them. And so we're seeing a lot more, a lot more women who are going into leadership in these communities, who are the ones that are, making the rules. But I think the most important part that First Nations communities do that's different than kind of, any other type of governance is making the decision as a community on the whole. So it's not one person in leadership who's making those decisions. It's a decision that's made by the entire community to make sure that everyone is informed, and it's not just being a top-down situation.
And it's also done for the betterment of communities. So in the same way, I believe that within the band where they might be living, they don't actually own the land as well, right? They are allowed to use the land, and they respect the land as a result, that it's their time to use it, gain benefit from it, and then it's passed to the next. And that's, I think, a big difference from the way the feudal system that we think about coming from our European heritage, where no, this is my land, that you see those borders there, don't cross that because I'm going to stop you. I think that's really interesting. So with all that said, I'm going to just quickly here launch our poll, so everybody can make sure that they tell us what a great job you did, and wonder if there's if anybody has any additional questions. I think I'm gonna leave if you can leave us with some thoughts. Do you think things are getting better? There's been pipelines that comes up, I can tell you, all the time in discussions in our investment community. We need to get the oil and the natural gas out of the country so we can export it. But if we can't get it to the borders, we can't export it. It's amazing, right? There's parts of Canada that are importing the fuel from or the fossil fuel from other countries because we can't get it within our own country. So how can we fix this? How can we deal with this issue?
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting. I think, one of the things that I had said earlier that I think is, really most important is really just talking to communities. I think it also helps that reconciliation in this topic is happening within education in schools, at least within Canada. I'm not sure about other places. And I think that, recognizing that you want to engage first before sort of making a decision and really listening to communities. There's actually the case of the pipeline within Ontario. Communities actually came back and said, we have a different route that we would like you to take that will not impact our traditional territory. It's not going to impact our hunting or harvesting rights. It's not going to impact, a lot of communities have burial sites, like sacred burial sites within their communities that they don't want to be dug up. And they said, this different route will not go along, this different route that we're proposing will not impact our way of life. And the owners of the pipeline said, no, we are sort of set in our ways. This is what we want to do. And so I think working collaboratively with communities to say, we have this end goal, we have this project that we want to complete. We want to work with you to do this so that there is benefit for both of us, not just for the corporation, but that there is benefit for the communities. And that essentially, you know, the benefits really outweigh the impacts, because with any project, there are going to be impacts. There's no doubt about it. But to make those as little as possible and to make sure that the benefits to the community are, you know, outweigh the impacts, you know, at least 10 to 1.
I love it. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Wonderful discussion, and you really enlightened us with a lot of things to make us more aware. There'll be some follow-up. If people have questions, they're welcome to reach out directly to Rebekah. She said that she can make herself available for discussion. Thank you, Rebekah. Appreciate your comments, and I wish you continued success.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.